At my daughter-in-law's so-called victory dinner, I noticed the way she raised her glass and smiled, not at me, but past me, as if I were already gone. To new beginnings, she said, her voice smooth and confident, and to finally having everything in the right hands. The table erupted in polite laughter, forks paused midair, glasses lifted, and for a moment, I simply sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap, as if I hadn't just heard my life reduced to a quiet transaction. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because what happened next wasn't something any of them saw coming. The dining room was beautifully arranged, I'll give her that. Soft candlelight flickered against crystal glasses, the long oak table dressed in white linen I didn't recognize, and every detail carefully curated to impress. Melissa had always been good at appearances. Even now, in her tailored navy dress, moving gracefully from one guest to another, she looked like the perfect hostess, warm smile, steady voice, a woman completely in control. My son sat beside her, quieter than usual, nodding along as she spoke, as if he had rehearsed his role and was determined not to forget a single line. I had been invited only 2 days earlier, a last-minute call that felt more like an obligation than a gesture. It's just a small family dinner, Mom, he said. We thought it would be nice to celebrate everything finally settling down. Settling down. That was the phrase he used. At the time, I told myself not to read into it. Families celebrate things. That's normal. But as I sat there that evening, watching the way conversations drifted around me instead of including me, the way certain words, estate, paperwork, transition, floated too casually between guests who had no business discussing them, I began to understand what this dinner really was. It wasn't a family gathering. It was a performance. And I was the only one who hadn't been given a script. Melissa returned to her seat, placing her hand lightly on my son's arm before lifting her glass again, this time turning slightly toward me. We couldn't have done this without everyone's support, she said, her eyes briefly meeting mine, her smile never wavering. It's been a long process, but everything is finally where it should be. Where it should be. I held her gaze for just a second longer than necessary, then looked down at my plate, untouched, the food growing cold in front of me. Because in that moment, I realized something that settled deep in my chest, not like a shock, but like a truth that had been waiting patiently for me to see it. They weren't celebrating with me. They were celebrating over me. I had almost convinced myself, on the drive over, that I was imagining things. That maybe I was being too sensitive, too quick to read meaning into harmless words. After all, grief has a way of distorting reality, of making ordinary moments feel heavier than they are. It had only been 8 months since my husband passed, and there were still mornings I reached for him without thinking. So when Daniel called and mentioned this dinner, I told myself it was a good sign. A step forward. A chance to feel like a family again instead of a collection of polite phone calls and distant check-ins. I even took my time getting ready, standing in front of my bedroom mirror longer than usual, smoothing the fabric of a soft gray dress Harold used to like, brushing my hair until it fell just right. I wanted to look like myself again, not the woman people pitied at funerals, not the one they spoke to in careful, softened tones, but the woman who had built a home, raised a son, and stood beside her husband through every hard year. When I arrived, Melissa greeted me at the door with that same practiced warmth she wore like a second skin. You look lovely, she said, air-kissing my cheek before guiding me inside. The house was fuller than I expected, friends, a few distant relatives, even a couple I didn't recognize at all. Everyone was dressed nicely, glasses already in hand, conversations flowing easily. It felt less like a family dinner and more like an event. I remember pausing just inside the doorway, taking it all in, trying to place myself within it. Where I fit. Where I was supposed to sit. Melissa answered that without asking, leading me to a chair near the end of the table, not isolated, but not central either. A place that said I was included, but not important. Daniel came over briefly, kissed my cheek, asked if I was comfortable, then disappeared back into a conversation with someone else before I could answer properly. I told myself not to take it personally. People get busy. Hosts have responsibilities. But as the evening unfolded, a pattern began to form, small things at first. Conversations that paused when I approached. Glances exchanged too quickly to be accidental. Words like finalized and transferred slipping into discussions that seemed to circle around me without ever landing directly in front of me. I smiled when expected, nodded when spoken to, played my part as the gracious mother who didn't want to make a scene. But underneath it all, something quiet and persistent began to take shape. A feeling I couldn't quite name yet, but couldn't ignore either. Because the more I watched, the more I realized this night hadn't been planned for me to be part of it. It had been planned for me to witness it. Dinner moved forward the way these things always do, courses served, glasses refilled, laughter rising and falling in waves that felt just a little too practiced. I stayed where I was, listening more than speaking, watching the way Melissa guided the rhythm of the evening without ever appearing to control it. She had a talent for that. Every topic seemed to pass through her first, every story somehow circling back to her voice, her version of events. Daniel followed along beside her, quieter, nodding at the right moments, offering small additions when prompted, like someone who had learned it was easier not to interrupt the flow. I noticed how often his hand rested near his glass, how rarely it reached for mine. That small distance said more than anything he could have explained. Halfway through the meal, one of the guests, a man I vaguely recognized from one of Daniel's work events, leaned forward with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Melissa was just telling us about all the paperwork you've been handling," he said, glancing between her and Daniel. "Must be a relief to finally have everything sorted out." Melissa let out a soft, modest laugh, lowering her gaze just enough to appear humble. "It's been a process," she said. "But we wanted to make sure everything was secure." Secure. The word landed heavier than it should have. I felt it settle somewhere deep, connecting itself to all the other fragments I'd been collecting throughout the night. I picked up my glass then, not to drink, but to give my hands something to do. "Paperwork can be complicated," I said lightly, my voice steady, conversational. "Especially when it involves family." For a brief moment, the table stilled. Not dramatically, just enough for me to feel it. Melissa's smile held, but her eyes flickered, quick and sharp, like she was measuring the distance between what I knew and what I didn't. "That's exactly why it's important to have the right people handling it," she replied smoothly. "People who understand how to manage things properly." Properly. I let the word pass without reacting, but inside, something shifted. Not confusion anymore. Not even suspicion. Recognition. Because suddenly, I could see the pattern clearly, not just tonight, but over the past few months. The afternoon she insisted on helping me organize my documents. The time she suggested consolidating accounts to make things easier. The papers Daniel had brought by one evening, already highlighted, already marked, needing only my signature while he stood there waiting, reassuring me it was all routine. I had signed them. Of course I had. Why wouldn't I trust my own son? Across the table, someone raised a glass again, offering another toast, this one less subtle than the first. "To Melissa," he said, smiling broadly now. "For taking care of everything and making sure the future is in good hands." There it was. Not hidden anymore. Not softened. Just laid out plainly, wrapped in celebration. Around me, glasses lifted, voices echoed the sentiment, and I felt the weight of it settle fully into place. This wasn't just about paperwork. This wasn't just about help. This was about control. And for the first time that evening, I didn't feel uncertain about what I was seeing. I felt something else entirely, something quiet, steady, and unmistakably clear. Because while they were busy celebrating what they thought they had secured, I was finally beginning to understand exactly what they believed they had taken. As the conversation carried on, I found myself drifting, not away from the table, but backward through time, tracing the quiet steps that had led me here. It hadn't happened all at once. Nothing like this ever does. It begins in small, reasonable suggestions, wrapped in concern, delivered with a smile. I remembered the afternoon Melissa first brought it up, standing in my kitchen with a folder tucked neatly under her arm. "You've been handling everything on your own for so long," she said gently, placing the papers down beside my coffee cup. "It might be a good idea to put something in place, just in case." Just in case. At the time, it sounded responsible. Thoughtful, even. Daniel had been there too, leaning against the counter, nodding along. "It's just a precaution, Mom," he added. "Nothing changes. You're still in control." I believed him. Of course I did. I signed where they pointed, trusting the familiarity of his voice more than the language on the page. Then there were the follow-ups, subtle, spaced out just enough not to raise concern. A phone call asking if I'd received a statement. A suggestion to combine accounts to simplify things. Melissa offering to organize my paperwork, her fingers moving quickly through documents that had once been private, her tone light as she explained what each one meant. I remember thinking how helpful she was, how lucky I was to have someone willing to take on the tedious parts of life I no longer cared for. I didn't notice how often she said we instead of you. I didn't question why certain decisions seemed to be made before I fully understood them. And Daniel, he never contradicted her. Not once. Across the table now, as laughter rose again and another round of wine was poured, those memories didn't feel distant anymore. They felt immediate. Connected. Each one a small thread that, when pulled together, formed something far more deliberate than I had allowed myself to see. I glanced at Daniel, watching the way he avoided my eyes, the way his posture tightened whenever the conversation drifted too close to specifics. He knew. Maybe not everything, maybe not from the beginning, but he knew enough. And he chose to stay quiet. Melissa, on the other hand, showed no hesitation. She leaned into the attention, responding to compliments with practiced modesty, accepting praise as if it were rightfully hers. "It just takes organization," she said at one point, smiling as she gestured lightly with her glass. "And making sure things are structured the way they should be." Structured. The word echoed in my mind, settling alongside the others: secure, managed, handled. Words that sounded responsible on the surface, but underneath, carried something else entirely. Something colder. I sat there, still and composed, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, and let the realization fully take hold. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a series of well-meaning decisions gone too far. It was a system. Carefully built. Quietly executed. And I had been placed at the center of it without ever being asked if I wanted to be there. But what they didn't know, what none of them could see as they raised their glasses and celebrated their version of the future, was that not every step of that system had gone the way they believed. Because while they were busy arranging things around me, I had already begun, quietly and deliberately, to rearrange them myself. It wasn't until a week after those papers were signed that something small, almost forgettable, began to bother me. I had gone to the bank, just a routine visit, the kind I'd done dozens of times before, and when I handed over my check, the young teller hesitated. Not long. Just enough to notice. Her smile stayed in place, but it tightened slightly at the corners, her eyes flickering to the screen, then back to me. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. Just verifying a few details." I didn't think much of it at the time. Why would I? Banks verify things. That's their job. But later that afternoon, sitting alone in my living room with the quiet pressing in around me, that moment came back, not as a clear memory, but as a feeling. Something slightly off. Something unfinished. So I went back the next day. Not because I had proof of anything, but because after a lifetime of managing a household, raising a child, and standing beside a man who trusted me with every decision, I had learned one thing: when something feels wrong, you don't ignore it. You look closer. This time, I asked to speak with someone privately. No urgency in my voice. No accusations. Just a simple request. They led me into a small office, and a woman introduced herself as the branch manager. Calm, professional, the kind of person who listens carefully before speaking. I liked that. It made what I was about to ask easier. I'd like to understand who has access to my accounts, I said. Straightforward. No hesitation. She nodded, turning her screen slightly as she reviewed the information. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. You've authorized a power of attorney, she said. Your daughter-in-law, Melissa. Hearing it spoken out loud felt different than seeing it on paper. More real. More final. I nodded once. And what exactly does that allow her to do? I asked. The manager explained it clearly: access, oversight, the ability to make financial decisions on my behalf. All the things I had been told were just precautions. But then she added something else. There have also been recent adjustments to your joint account, she said. Transfers. Consolidations. My chest tightened, but my face didn't show it. Who initiated those? I asked quietly. Another pause. The activity appears to have been coordinated under the authority granted, she replied carefully. Coordinated. Such a polite word for something that suddenly felt very deliberate. In that moment, everything aligned. The conversations. The documents. The way Melissa spoke as if things were already decided. This wasn't preparation. It was execution. Quiet, methodical, and already in motion. I sat there for a second longer, letting the weight of it settle, not as panic, not as fear, but as clarity. Because once you see something clearly, you don't have to guess anymore. I'd like to make some changes, I said finally, my voice steady, almost calm. The manager nodded without hesitation. Of course. And as she reached for the necessary forms, I realized something that felt both unsettling and strangely empowering. They thought they were steps ahead of me. They thought everything was already in place. But they had made one mistake. They assumed I wouldn't look closely. I didn't rush through the changes. That was the first thing I decided. If they had taken their time building this quiet structure around me, then I would take mine dismantling it, piece by piece, without drawing attention. The branch manager sat across from me, patient, professional, sliding each document forward only after I had finished reading the last. We can revoke the power of attorney immediately, she explained, her tone neutral but attentive. And we can restrict any further access to your accounts unless you personally authorize it. I nodded, not because I needed reassurance, but because I understood exactly what that meant. Control. Mine. Returned, not given. Do it, I said simply. The pen felt heavier than it should have as I signed the first form, but not because of doubt. Because of clarity. Each signature wasn't just ink on paper, it was a quiet correction. A reversal of assumptions. A boundary drawn where there hadn't been one before. When she moved on to the joint account, I paused just briefly. Not out of hesitation, but to consider the weight of what came next. I'd like to close it, I said. The manager looked up, just for a moment, making sure I was certain. And transfer the remaining balance into a new account. Solely under my name. There was no judgment in her expression. Just understanding. We can take care of that today, she replied. Today. That word settled into place with a kind of quiet finality. Not next week. Not after another conversation. Today. While they were still speaking in careful tones and celebrating plans that hadn't fully come together yet, I was already moving. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just, decisively. The process took time, verifications, confirmations, signatures, but I didn't rush any of it. I asked questions when I needed to. I listened carefully. And for the first time in months, I felt like I was the one directing the conversation, not following it. By the time we finished, the structure they had relied on no longer existed in the way they believed it did. The authority had been revoked. The account had been cleared and re-established under my control. Quiet changes, on paper. But in reality, something much larger had shifted. Because they hadn't just underestimated my awareness. They had underestimated my ability to act. Before I left, I gathered the final documents into a simple envelope. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would draw attention. Just proof. The kind you don't need to explain, only present. As I stepped outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than it had the day before, the air lighter in a way I hadn't noticed in months. I stood there for a moment, letting that feeling settle, not as relief, but as confirmation. They believed everything was already decided. That the outcome had been secured. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't have known as they planned that dinner, as they raised their glasses and rehearsed their version of the future, was that the foundation they were celebrating was already gone. Letting the silence settle around me. This silence didn't feel heavy like it had before. It felt clear. I moved through the house slowly, not searching for anything, just noticing. The small details. The familiarity of it all. The life I had built, piece by piece, long before anyone thought they had a claim to it. In the living room, I paused by the bookshelf, my fingers brushing lightly over the spines, remembering the years when Daniel would sit on the floor, flipping through pages he barely understood, asking questions I always tried to answer. Back then, everything was simple. Trust wasn't something you questioned. It was something you lived inside. By the time evening settled in, I had already made my decision about the dinner. I would go. Not because I believed what they had told me, and not because I needed answers anymore. I already had those. I would go because sometimes, the clearest way to end something is to let it reveal itself completely. To see it through, without interruption. Without resistance. I chose my clothes carefully that night, not to impress anyone, not to make a statement, but because I wanted to feel like myself again. I stood in front of the mirror for a moment, adjusting the collar of my blouse, smoothing the fabric with steady hands. The woman looking back at me didn't look uncertain. She didn't look lost. She looked composed. Grounded. Someone who understood exactly where she stood. Before I left, I picked up the envelope from the counter and slipped it quietly into my bag. No hesitation. No second thoughts. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't even a defense. It was simply the truth, neatly folded, waiting for the right moment to be seen. As I turned off the lights and stepped outside, locking the door behind me, I felt something settle into place. Not a plan, not a strategy. Just certainty. Because whatever they believed this dinner would be, I already knew how it would end. By the time I arrived back at the house for the dinner, the evening had already settled into that soft, golden hour where everything looks warmer than it really is. The lights inside were glowing through the windows, laughter spilling faintly onto the front porch. As I approached. For a brief moment, I paused at the door, my hand resting lightly against the handle, listening. Not to the words themselves, but to the tone. Light. Confident. Certain. The kind of certainty that only comes when people believe everything is already decided. Then I opened the door and stepped inside. Melissa noticed me first, of course. She always did. Her smile appeared instantly, polished and effortless, as she crossed the room toward me. There you are, she said warmly, leaning in as if nothing in the world had shifted beneath her feet. We were just about to start the next course. Her hand rested briefly on my arm, guiding me, not firmly, but with that same subtle control she had always used. I let her. Not because I needed direction, but because I didn't need to resist it anymore. The table was fuller now, voices overlapping, glasses half raised, conversations already in motion. Daniel glanced up as I took my seat, offering me a quick smile, relieved, almost, like my presence confirmed that everything was still going according to plan. That nothing had changed. I returned the smile gently, giving him exactly what he expected to see. That was the easiest part. Dinner continued as if nothing had happened. Plates were passed, stories exchanged, laughter echoed in the spaces between sentences. Melissa moved effortlessly through it all, steering conversations, filling silences, making sure every moment carried the same underlying message, that this evening mattered. That it meant something. And it did. Just not in the way she believed. I stayed quiet for the most part, listening, observing, letting the rhythm of the night unfold around me. Occasionally, someone would turn to me with a polite question, how I'd been, how I was holding up, whether I liked the meal, and I answered simply, calmly, without offering anything more than what was asked. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I no longer needed to fill the space. At one point, I noticed the envelope resting quietly in my bag, exactly where I had placed it. I didn't reach for it. Not yet. Timing matters. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a way that allows the truth to land exactly where it belongs. So I waited. Not impatiently. Not anxiously. Just, knowingly. Across the table, Melissa was speaking again, her voice rising slightly above the others as she shared another story, this one about long processes and finally getting things settled. The guests listened, nodding, smiling, some of them already understanding the version of the story she was telling. I watched her carefully, not with resentment, but with clarity. She wasn't guessing anymore. She believed she had one. And that belief, that quiet confidence sitting just beneath her words, was exactly what made the moment that was coming so inevitable. Because while they were enjoying the evening, while they were reinforcing the narrative they had built together, they didn't realize something simple. The outcome they were celebrating no longer existed. It happened just after the main course was cleared, when the room had settled into that comfortable rhythm where people feel bold enough to say what they really think, disguised as compliments, wrapped in laughter. Glasses were refilled, chairs shifted slightly closer together, and Melissa stood up with an ease that suggested this moment had always been hers. She didn't tap her glass, didn't call for attention. She didn't need to. The room naturally quieted around her. I just want to say something, she began, her voice warm, confident, practiced. Her hand rested lightly on the back of Daniel's chair, a subtle gesture that positioned them as a unit. These past few months have been a transition for all of us. She paused, letting the words settle, her eyes briefly scanning the table before continuing. But I'm proud of how we've handled it. It's not easy stepping in and making sure everything is taken care of, especially when it comes to family and legacy. Legacy. That word landed heavier than the rest. Around the table, heads nodded, expressions softened, a few murmurs of agreement passed quietly between guests. She smiled at them, accepting their understanding as if it had already been earned. There were a lot of moving parts, she went on, lifting her glass slightly now, but we made sure everything ended up where it belongs. Safe. Managed. Protected for the future. I could feel the shift then, not just in the room, but in the meaning behind her words. This wasn't subtle anymore. This wasn't implied. It was a declaration. And the people around us responded exactly the way she expected. Someone raised their glass higher. Another voice chimed in, "You did an incredible job, Melissa." Laughter followed, light and approving. Daniel nodded beside her, his expression tight but compliant, like he had committed to seeing this through. And honestly, Melissa added, her tone softening just enough to sound gracious, it's a relief knowing that everything is finally in the right hands. There it was. Not hidden. Not softened. just placed carefully in the center of the table for everyone to see. A statement that didn't need clarification, because everyone hearing it already understood what she meant. Or at least, what she wanted them to believe. Glasses lifted again. Voices echoed her sentiment. To new beginnings. To stability. To family. I picked up my glass then, mirroring the movement, not out of agreement, but because I understood the moment for what it was. This was the peak. The point where everything they believed converged into a single, shared certainty. That the process was complete. That the outcome was secure. That nothing could change what had already been decided. Melissa's eyes found mine briefly as she smiled, her expression calm, assured, almost generous, as if including me in this moment was an act of kindness. I held her gaze, steady and unreadable, then raised my glass just slightly in return. Not high enough to celebrate. Just enough to acknowledge. Because while the room filled with quiet confidence and satisfied laughter, while they toasted to a future they believed they controlled, I understood something they didn't. They weren't celebrating a victory. They were celebrating an illusion. I set my glass down before the sound of the last toast had fully faded, the soft clink against the table barely noticeable beneath the lingering laughter. No one was looking at me anymore. They were still caught in the moment Melissa had created, her version of the story, her carefully constructed ending. That was when I reached for my bag. Not abruptly. Not in a way that would draw attention. Just a simple, deliberate movement, like everything else I had done that evening. Melissa, I said gently. Not loud, not sharp. Just enough to cut through the space between conversations. Her head turned toward me almost instantly, her smile still in place, though something in her eyes flickered, curiosity, maybe. Or the faintest hint of irritation at being interrupted. Yes, she replied, her tone smooth, expectant. I met her gaze calmly, then glanced briefly at Daniel before returning my attention to her. Since we're all here, I said, my voice even, steady, and since you've been so thoughtful in explaining how everything has been handled, I thought it might be a good time to clarify a few things. The room didn't go silent immediately, but it shifted. Conversations slowed, attention redirected in small, almost imperceptible ways. Melissa's smile tightened just slightly, though she held it in place. Of course, she said. What would you like to clarify? I opened the envelope then, sliding out the single sheet of paper and placing it on the table in front of me. I didn't push it toward her right away. I let it sit there, visible but unexplained. You mentioned that everything is now in the right hands, I continued. That it's all been secured, managed, protected. A few guests glanced at each other. Daniel shifted in his seat. Melissa didn't move. That's right, she said carefully. I nodded once. Then you should know, I said, my tone unchanged, that as of yesterday morning, your power of attorney has been revoked. The words didn't land all at once. They settled slowly, like something the room needed a second to understand. Melissa blinked, her expression holding for just a fraction too long before it shifted. I'm sorry, she said, a quiet edge slipping into her voice. I slid the paper toward her now. It's all there, I said. Filed and confirmed. Daniel leaned forward first, reaching for the document before she could, his eyes scanning it quickly, then again more slowly. Mom, he started, but the word didn't go anywhere. It just hung there. And the joint account, I added, before either of them could recover, the one you've both been managing so carefully. I paused just long enough for their attention to lock back onto me. It's been closed. The funds have been transferred. This time, the silence was immediate. Complete. Melissa's hand hovered just above the table, as if she had been about to reach for something and forgotten what it was. Transferred, she repeated, her voice no longer smooth, no longer controlled. I nodded gently. $250,000, I said. No longer where you think it is. Around us, the room had gone still in a way that couldn't be mistaken for politeness. This wasn't part of the evening they had planned. This wasn't something anyone had rehearsed. Daniel looked up at me then, really looked, as if seeing me clearly for the first time that night. And in his expression, I didn't see anger. Not yet. Just shock. Melissa, however, didn't look shocked. She looked unprepared. And that difference, that small, undeniable shift, was all it took for the entire room to understand something had gone very, very wrong. For a moment, no one spoke. Not because they were being polite, but because there was nothing ready to fill the space I had just opened. The kind of silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was exposed. Raw. The kind that forces people to sit with something they weren't prepared to face. Daniel was still holding the paper, his eyes moving across the lines as if reading them again might somehow change what they said. "Mom, when did you do this?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of the confidence he had carried all evening. "Yesterday morning," I replied calmly. No hesitation. No explanation beyond what was necessary. Melissa let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, not quite disbelief, but something sharper. "That's not possible," she said, her tone tightening, the composure she had maintained all night beginning to fracture at the edges. Everything was already arranged." I looked at her steadily. "Yes," I said. "You arranged quite a bit." That landed harder than anything else. Not because it was loud, but because it didn't need to be. Around the table, a few guests shifted uncomfortably, their earlier enthusiasm replaced with quiet uncertainty. No one reached for their glass this time. No one tried to smooth it over. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was something much clearer. Daniel set the paper down slowly, his hand lingering on it for just a second longer than necessary. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked, and there it was again, that question. Not what happened. Not how. But why he hadn't been included. I folded my hands gently in front of me. "You didn't tell me either," I said. His eyes dropped. No argument. No correction. Just silence. Melissa, however, wasn't willing to let it settle there. "We were protecting you," she said quickly, leaning forward now, her voice edged with urgency. "You don't understand how complicated these things are. We were trying to make sure everything was handled properly." Properly? I repeated softly. Not mocking. Just clarifying. She stopped. Just for a second. But it was enough. I let the pause sit between us before continuing, my tone unchanged. "You made decisions about my life without asking me. You accessed things that were never yours to manage. And you stood here tonight, celebrating it. No raised voice. No accusation. Just the truth, placed plainly where everyone could see it." The room felt smaller now, the warmth of the evening replaced by something far more honest. Daniel leaned back slightly, as if putting distance between himself and something he could no longer deny. Melissa's posture stiffened, her control slipping not in words, but in the way she held herself, tighter, less certain. "So what now?" she asked, her voice quieter, but no less sharp. I looked at her, then at Daniel, then briefly around the table at the faces that had been so certain just moments before. "Now?" I said gently. "Now nothing changes. At least not for me." I reached for my bag, closing it calmly, the same way I had opened it. No sudden movements. No drama. "I go home," I continued. "To my house. I manage my life the way I always have." Daniel swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "And thus?" I met his eyes, not unkindly. But without softening the truth. "That depends on what you choose to do next." No anger. No final declaration. Just a boundary. And somehow, that was heavier than anything I could have said. When I stood up from that table, no one tried to stop me. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how. The room that had been so full of confidence just minutes earlier now felt different, like something essential had been removed from it. I picked up my bag, smoothing the fabric of my sleeve out of habit more than necessity, and for a brief moment, I let my eyes rest on the table one last time. The glasses, half full. The plates, barely touched. The people, suddenly unsure of where to look. This had been her victory dinner. That's what she called it, even if not in so many words. And now, there was nothing left to celebrate. I walked toward the door at the same steady pace I had used all evening, not rushing, not hesitating. Just moving forward. Daniel didn't follow immediately, but I could feel his presence shift behind me, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words fast enough to catch up. At the doorway, I paused, not dramatically, not to turn the moment into something it didn't need to be, but just long enough to acknowledge what had happened. Then I stepped outside. The night air was cool, quieter than I expected, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself a full breath. Not relief exactly, but something close to it. A release. The kind that comes when you no longer have to hold something in place just to keep the peace. I walked to my car, the sound of my footsteps steady against the pavement, and as I reached for the door, I heard it. Mom. I turned. Daniel was standing just outside the door now, the light from inside falling across his face in a way that made him look younger for a moment. Uncertain. Not the man who had sat at that table, nodding along, but the boy I used to know, the one who didn't always get things right, but still looked to me when he needed to understand how. I didn't realize, he said, his voice low, uneven. I studied him for a second, not searching for an excuse, not waiting for one either. Just listening. You didn't ask, I replied gently. The words weren't harsh. They didn't need to be. He nodded slowly, like he understood more from that than anything else I could have said. For a moment, it seemed like he might take a step closer, like he might try to fix something that had already shifted too far to be repaired in a single conversation. But he didn't. And that, too, was an answer. I gave him a small nod in return, not as forgiveness, not as closure, but as acknowledgement. Then I got into my car and drove away. No music. No distractions. Just the quiet road ahead and the steady rhythm of something inside me finally settling into place. When I got home, the house welcomed me the way it always had, unchanged, familiar, mine. I set my bag down, walked through each room without thinking, and paused for a moment in the living room where everything still felt exactly as it should be. Not because nothing had happened, but because I had chosen what would remain. I didn't need to call anyone. I didn't need to explain. The truth had already been said, and it had landed exactly where it needed to. What came next would unfold in its own time. Because in the end, it was never about the dinner. It was never about the money. It was about something much simpler. They believed they had secured my life. But they forgot one thing. It was never theirs to take.